Presence, the podcast for everyone interested in bodywork, embodiment, and somatic practices. I'm Andrew Rosenstock, your host and guide on this enlightening journey. With my expertise as a somatic movement therapist, yoga therapist, and certified Rolfer, I'll merge clinical insight with real-world experience to enrich our discussions with our guests. Through engaging and informative talks, this podcast delves into mind-body paradigms, offering insights and strategies to empower personal growth. Your support is vital for our grassroots and lo-fi production. If you connect with our content, please leave a positive review and subscribe on your preferred platform. Your engagement helps us reach a broader audience and supports our mission. So thanks for tuning in today to Touching into Presence. Fasten your seatbelt as we embark on a journey to explore the transformative power of contemplative and somatic practices together. It was a pleasure to be in conversation today with Alan Richardson. Alan is a certified advanced Rolfer and movement practitioner with a private practice in London, UK since 1998. He's also qualified as a craniosacral therapist. Alan is passionate about knowing other cultures and languages, having lived in Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and Brazil. He's just returned to London after practicing in the south of Brazil for 1 year. Today's conversation was incredibly enriching for me and marks another episode in the Colleagues Corner branch of our podcast. Alan and I delved into our shared interest in embodiment, phenomenology, and trauma work, exploring how these concepts shape our practices as Rolfers and movement therapists. We examined the importance of considering the whole person, integrating subjective experience and lifestyle while recognizing the potential for self-healing. Additionally, we discussed the challenges of conveying the value of embodiment and the need to balance intellectual inquiry with physical activity and emotional regulation. Just a heads up, we kind of dive into it from the beginning, and we get a little bit, I might say, nerdy or geeky, as it's a subject we both really enjoy. But very quickly we get out of that. So if it seems a little bit too much in one way or another at first, I just say hang on a bit and then it's going to even out. But hopefully it's all wonderful for you. Anyways, enough of this intro. Let's get into the talk. I appreciate you making the time, especially on shorter notice. But I've been enjoying our back and forths.
Yeah, me too.
And that's also one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation, and not so much about you and me, but this sort of thing that I'm hoping to do is to have conversations that spark curiosity, not just for the people speaking, but the people listening, especially the people listening who don't have regular colleagues to talk about it. I find one of the most important parts about this type of work we do is the sharing and exploration and inquiry and questioning with other practitioners, with colleagues or the sort. It's that this thing is coming up and either like I really love it or I want to share it, or I've got 85% of what I think it is, and let's have a conversation and see how does that fill me in and how does that put me into a direction that may be more filling in. So thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking me.
Yeah. Well, I was, we had our little pre-messages. There's a few areas we can go down, and maybe we'll go down some or all. We'll see. But, a few of the things that we talked about is this sense of either what is embodiment to us, which I know you have an article coming out, so that might not be something you do want to talk about yet.
I'm not secretive.
Okay.
I'm okay talking about it.
Another thing is sort of pain science and the importance of it. And that was where I first, I think, saw your name, and I read your article. And the first thing I thought was, I want to reach out to him and just say, can I share this article with clients? Because I found your article really helpful to not oversimplify, I want to say, because it's not like it's too simple and it has nothing to it, but it helps simplify a very complex topics such as what is pain, and then also thinking about it in relation to our work, because we are so mixed. I mean, we've talked about this on the show before, and I'm sure you hear this a lot. People come in and they say, "Oh, Rolfing, that's the most painful, thing," and I'm usually, and I have, colleagues around where I work who still make it very painful. And I'm trying to say, no, that actually, that not only is that not needed, it might not even be helpful, and it might actually be detrimental. So maybe chatting about that.
Yeah.
But the two other topics we might see if we get into is phenomenology, which I know you've sort of been in some way resistant or reticent to do because you're not an expert. But I also think that that will be a good talk because,
No, I love the subject. I
yeah,
just, yeah, well, we can talk about that, but
yeah.
why I upset had that reaction at first, yeah?
Well, there was another topic, but I think why not just in some way maybe start with that. One of the things that I think people who do know me know is that I, in the last few years especially, have really gotten into phenomenology, especially how it relates to Rolfing, but for me, how it really relates to body work. And I am no scholar either on it, but I have, and I've shared this before. I think you'll appreciate this. I don't remember if I texted this to you, but my first, actually, it's in the article I wrote, but my first Rolfing 10 series client was a professor of philosophy, and in particular phenomenology was his specialty. And
Beautiful.
yeah, and he said, I said to me, he said, you're doing my work embodied. And I just nodded my head
Ah,
like, oh, okay, having no idea at that point really what that meant. I had read Spacious Body 1.5 times maybe, and still wasn't, I just hadn't connected with Jeff and the work at the time. So I didn't really get it. But later coming back, like the recognition of phenomenology, how important it is to us, it's just become a yeah, a major resource in mine. And
yeah.
I love talking about it. And I do think it's important for our community. So while neither of us are experts, I'm happy to, yeah, uh, how did you get into it? What what brought you into it, or what excites you about it?
Yeah, um, that's a good question. I think there was a time about 10 years ago when I was involved in a Facebook group about
Mm,
philosophy. And we nutted out quite a few interesting discussions. And I think phenomenology came up there. And I remember going on to a philosophy series hosted by
mm,
Brian McGee in, I think,
oh yeah,
the 80s. And I
yeah,
saw
wow.
the Dreyfus one, and I just thought that's really good,
Mm,
concise, half an hour. He boils it down to this interesting theme of a subject in a context and how a subject relates to objects in that context. And he was contrasting that with, shall we say, traditional philosophy, which tend to separate the subject.
mm,
And, his image, I think, if I remember correctly, was the very dry, boring image of a philosopher holding a pen and saying, how do I know this is a pen, or something like this, which is
mm,
extremely boring. I mean,
mm,
and I think I'm very interested in phenomenology. The problem I have with it, when we consider how it touches on our movement work, is I tried to read Being and Time, and I
mm,
bought Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty just sat on my shelf after I'd looked at it for about 5 minutes and thought, you've got to be kidding.
mm.
I'm not going to go through this. I know some people would find it really interesting, but I thought, what I want is the immediate takeaway from phenomenology without having to do the dry intellectual work of doing it. I went through Being and Time, and I had a ruler, and I was underlining stuff, and I really got into it. And actually, Being in Time was quite juicy, but I gave up after a third of the time. So the disconnect for me is matching the intellectual, because phenomenology is about the subject and about the experience of life. Yet, when it's talked about in philosophy, it can come across as dry. And just like any other philosophy, it can sometimes seem like just a matter of who's the best at wielding the definitions.
Yeah, it's a thing I find with some of my I have a few clients who are professors of philosophy or of psychology, but deal with more maybe philosophical, and it's a hard, how do we explain this without a guy I work with who is a professor of embodiment, and
Wow.
we have calls often, or we did before I had the child. I have to give him a call, but we'd have these talks of trying to, actually, we wanted to maybe have a project together because he conceptualized it. I mean, he would even say, I understand this, I can write about it, but I don't actually live it. And
Mhm.
you are living it, but you can't really write about it. And so
Exactly.
like and there are people who can do both for sure. But I understand that that's where it can be sort of tricky, because if we get too much into the weeds of the words and this, now we are no longer in the experience of it. We're in trying to describe the experience, which is in some way a take out of the phenomenological. Although I would say that there is still the phenomenological there is still the being in the being of, but
Yeah.
that'll be a bit of a sort of rabbit hole.
But
But
Andrew,
yeah.
may I ask you also what you
Yeah.
think, what is phenomenology to you? Because I
Mm.
don't know where you're really coming from on this yet fully, and it's for
Yeah.
you.
So Heidegger's being in time, or in his what he came up with as Dasein, or just being in time or being in the world, is a central proponent of it. And Merleau-Ponty, he mentioned, and uh, other practitioners later, I think, are important of it for my foundation. My foundation really came again from Jeff Maitland and
Hmm.
reading Spacious Body in particular, and taking time with it. But I also had a background in studying Buddhism and yoga philosophy for years, which I would say a lot of Buddhist philosophy is somewhat the same as phenomenology. So let me kind of say what that takes it to for me to be is looking at phenomena, which are or experiences, are events or materials, could even, I'd say, be it. It's just things happening. It's the things, what is arising prior to us labeling it as a thing, giving it the value that we ascribe it to be,
Hmm.
as opposed to the value it either inherently has, or the value before value. Again, I think
Hmm.
words get a challenge in this. Um, so it is this things as they, in Buddhism, it's things as they arise, or the seeing of that for me is the basis of phenomenology. Is how do we, for the way I would say it, and my where I am sort of in relation to it, is how can we be with things, how can we observe or be or whatever that perceive with things right before we give it a cognitive or cortical value.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. It's interesting also that you studied Buddhism and yoga philosophy, because I also find that fascinating. Buddhism, I think, is a wonderful worldview,
Hmm.
and it's got such a good framework, the Noble Truths and
Hmm.
the Eightfold Path, and this all this kind of Joseph Goldstein stuff. I listened to a lot of Joseph Goldstein, and I think, I also lived in Japan for 4 years, and without doing meditation or anything at that stage of my life, you get a feel for how different that can be, that Eastern way of looking at things.
Mm.
I think Japanese people are very much embedded in nature, although I remember asking them, they won't really acknowledge that. They won't acknowledge
Mm.
the spiritual in any way like that.
Mm.
Um, I think that, the different cultures have different ways of being, don't they, really? So,
Hmm.
and I think it's interesting that you make that parallel between Buddhism and yoga philosophy and phenomenology. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I like that.
Well, I mean, I could be biased from that because of my own studies, but I think when you look at what Buddha was trying to do was to figure out the nature of reality.
Hmm.
And he had these things. It's so hard to know whether Buddha had it or whether people later had it and ascribed it to him. But these things called
Hmm.
kalapas, which is like his measurement of sort of what I take to be phenomena. These like these things you couldn't see but were in time and space.
Mm.
And so I remember when reading, and actually a side note, my friends of mine who are professors of philosophy, and there are groups that are about Heidegger and mindfulness, or Heidegger and Buddhism, and overlaps between them. And
Oh,
I don't know,
really?
yeah, I don't know enough to say was Heidegger inspired, and or Husserl, his main teacher, were they inspired by what we'll call Eastern contemplative
Mm.
practices. I don't know enough about that. I also think at some point, I've had the joy of living in many different cultures and parts of the world. And what I always find interesting is at some point at the end of the day, like a human is a human. So
Yeah, yeah, sure.
when you distill things down, like sometimes people say, "Oh wow, that you must have got it from that," where it says, "Well, I was actually just thinking about this with my daughter, and she's starting to make sounds, and she's going and I'm thinking, well, most languages probably have an sound in it, right?
Sure.
Not because it's at the root of it, it's just a human basic thing, and so whether or not
Completely.
whether they were drawing from it or not, I'm not a scholar enough to know, but I think when you kind of break things down to a basics, yeah, there'll be overlap. And yoga, much of yoga philosophy comes out of Buddhism, and
Hmm.
the Samkhya philosophy has a lot drawing from Buddhism because of the time and place where everything was kind of mixing, and so
Mm.
academically looking at it, a lot of like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are really sort of a lot of the same as Buddhist frameworks, with just a little bit extra stuff shifted and added on. Even the I only remember this sutra because I had to study it in my first yoga training. Yoga Sutra 133 are these like Maitri Karuna Mudita Upekshana. Well, you have that in Buddhism before too. Metta,
Hmm.
Maitri is the Sanskrit word. Metta is the Pali word, but it's the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
core principles. So you have it within both because they were it was a melting pot then, and then
yeah.
later coming through, and then later when you get into uh, various tantric philosophies, that's when you start having non-dual. Well, you have it a little before. This is probably very boring for a lot of people. We'll bring it back to body work, but for you and me it's not. You have a bit of this, the non-dual, and for me the non-dual is really where phenomenology shines, because you're talking about the subject object before. The we in the dualistic framework can never really connect into that. We're always in, I guess, that subject as subject looking, thinking we're the object.
Yeah,
But when we're in that non-dualistic, all of a sudden phenomenology really makes sense, both in the terms of mind, but also felt, because we're now in this slight other framework where we can be in observance. I sometimes would say that the non-dual can observe the dual, but not vice versa. And so similarly, it's for me a very phenomenological framework.
interesting. Yeah,
I want to pivot a bit because I think you and I could vibe
sure,
on that, but some people might be like, "What?" And so,
sure.
for to bring it back, I guess, to our community is how does what you understand of phenomenology? How do you bring that into the work, or how does that inform your work, or why is that important for the work?
Well, I've got a quote by Uwe Goddard here, and it's
Mm,
posture is not a position, but a dynamic act of relationship with the world.
mm, mm,
So I think
yeah.
you mentioned rare people who are good at mixing the
Mm,
intellectual and the lived experience of phenomenology. Obviously, Uwe Goddard is one of those people. Yeah.
for sure, for sure.
So what I find interesting about it is it seems that the actual living experience of life that is encouraged, let's say, through Rolfing movement, inspired
Mhm,
by Uwe Goddard and people who came before him, seems to match onto the intellectual framework of phenomenology.
mhm,
And then you look at neuroscience to do with that, and it all seems to be pointing to some kind of reality. And just because the books are difficult to read doesn't mean that there's a really clear match there between the intellectual framework of phenomenology and the lived experience. And I
mm,
think that what we do as Rolfers is holistic in the sense that we're not interested only in the biomechanical. The biomechanical is important, and that's a subset of the biomedical.
mhm,
It's really important, but if you go too far into that with blinkered vision, you end up
mhm,
missing the most important piece, in my opinion, which is a person,
mhm,
client, a Rolfer, exists within a context.
mhm,
And in a Rolfing session or a series of sessions, it's an intersubjective interplay between two people creating a therapeutic field.
mm.
And I think phenomenology is a good background way of looking at that, because it honors the subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think we lose a lot if we do not acknowledge the whole lifestyle of the client and what's informing that. There are things like
Mm-hmm.
trauma can come into this, the whole Peter Levine framework, somatic experiencing. And you get so much richer in the whole process if you leave space for that and create space for that to just unfold. Whereas if you just go in and, what I think Jeff Maitland would call it, a second paradigm, just fix the knee.
Mm-hmm.
Not only are you not getting that, but I think if you adhere too closely to that, you end up really literally throwing the most important thing out.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people may talk about placebo, saying, oh, well, you were cheating, it's just placebo. But what more fascinating thing than could there be than placebo, which is basically, in my mind, a synonym for self-healing property, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be finessed to enhance that effect. It isn't, I wouldn't say it's all placebo, but you don't want it to be a dynamic where the practitioner is some kind of magician or someone holding knowledge much far away from the person that they're treating.
Well, yeah, I think I'm gonna agree, but I would say I think you and I don't want that. I think there are practitioners who do want that.
Maybe. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nor do I. I mean, there is I remember when training, the watching one of my teachers who had a magical quality, which I now can understand, but couldn't understand then, and really wanting that as in yogis would call it the siddhi, right? Getting that magical thing, and then really striving to get it because it seemed powerful,
Yeah.
and then later, presumably, kind of getting it, but getting it because I no longer was striving for it. And then kind of when a client will say, oh, this, you're like a magician, really having to have my ego not be there, because my ego
Sure.
loves that, of course. Oh my God, yeah, getting knowledge, but really of being like, no, I'm not. This is just, it's,
Yeah.
you can do this. Yeah. You can do this. We've just studied a lot and learned a lot and learned how to just really perceive, because that's the key. When I think of the biomechanical model, I think the biomechanical model is great. But when I watch people walk, they say, okay, they've been to PT, they say, okay, you're going to look at my gait. And I say, not exactly. I'm just going to perceive how you move through life.
Mm-hmm.
That's really it. And so if your foot isn't moving in a certain way, I'm not so concerned about that. I'm concerned with, in Rolfing terms, how is that adaptable strategy served you, and how is it not, and where is it coming from?
Yeah. I mean, I remember in one of Michael Salverson's articles, him talking about this seductive quality of being the magician in the classroom. Yeah. And it was quite humorous because he had this, he was describing how, because he was in the position of being a teacher, being watched by all these eager to learn students, it seemed that his powers were increased by that field. Mm. And then he went home and his wife asked him to do the dishes. Mm. And which seemed mundane. And then he went up and did the dishes, and he wondered why she wasn't clapping him after he finished,
I haven't read that article.
Yeah, I can't remember which one it is. If I find it, I'll send it to you. It's really funny, that.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's actually giving me a side. Maybe later we'll get to about articles, because you and I both have written. But I think that's. Yeah, I'm laughing a lot at myself of sort of similar of having a great day, seeing 5 clients, and just being like really helpful, and then coming home and having my wife be upset with me or something, and being like, what? Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And fair enough to her. Her being upset for me for something I probably did, like
Of
that. I
course,
deserved it. I deserved it.
yeah. But I honestly believe that we're at our most powerful when we're the most humble with our skills.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I also think that there's, at least in my own experience, there's this sort of thing there that once we, and this can tie into a bit of phenomenology or embodiment too, of once we kind of understand that, then we are, what I tell my clients a lot, and so for those listening, they won't be able to see because but I'll have my sort of hand in front of my face and looking through the fingers saying, hey, I'm not looking now, or hey, I'm not going to be, I'm going to be very humble. So it's like we're trying to still, at least for myself, I'm still trying to still be humble in a way, because I haven't fully just because when I first get the idea of it, I say, oh yes, perfect, I understand that. I
Mm.
haven't fully necessarily embodied it. And so
Mhm.
I'm then playing the role of performing the humbleness, which
Oh
kind of
yeah, well,
it works for a while until all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, no. And then that hit, not a good hit of like dopamine, but that like strike down of, hey, you got work to still do,
but
which
I think there's
itself,
a way around that.
okay,
For me, I
I could
think
use
I've
that.
found a way around that, which
Okay.
is really, I really see it that the role is to galvanize self-healing properties. Like Ida Rolf said, you're not practitioners curing disease, you're
Hmm.
practitioners invoking health. That
Hmm.
that's that is, if someone says you're a magician, which it does happen,
Hmm.
that was amazing, you're a magician. The first thing I say is, well, actually, this is coming from you as well. It's not just
Hmm.
me.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is an ongoing individual kind of journey for everybody, I think, where the ego comes in, where how can we step away from our ego without that itself being egotistical, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, even when you say you've kind of got it, my first thought was, well, yeah, you have, and you could tell me the secret, and I would take it and say, oh, okay, I get it, but I still would take time to actually get it and embody it for me and my framework.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And there's that
yeah.
word again, embody, yeah? How does a client view that? What if we say that we're going to improve, no, improve's not a good word, deepen a sense of embodiment.
Hmm.
Is that something that clients would be interested in as a kind of selling point for Rolfing? Or is it something that people would say, well, that sounds a bit woo-woo? Because I really think that a lot of people
Hmm.
aren't very connected to their bodies. And I
Sure.
believe that Rolfing is a really powerful tool for helping reconnection with a sense of, you know, living in a body. I think
I
it's a
mean,
modern phenomenon, but maybe it's gone through the ages because we've got this extra development in our brain that we can think about things, we can plan things, we can be aware of things. So is there innate conflict between mind and body in human beings per se, or is it just the Cartesian split and nowadays digital age, social media addiction, and comparison culture, and not connecting with each other in physical proximity?
well,
I
yeah.
suspect it's something that's inherent in human nature.
I think, yeah. I mean, my first answer to that question goes back to my Rolfing training when Michael Pollan, who was a teacher at the time, sort of left the answer to every question we asked him was that depends, and my whole class hated him at the time.
I met
but
him.
later I thought, oh, what brilliance, and I
Yeah,
just was we weren't ready for it at that time. I
right,
wasn't.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
it sort of, I think the answer is it sort of depends on going at least to, like, what if we're marketing Rolfing on that? I would say I do, but I do that for some clients and not for others. But I'm ultimately, in fact, I'm working on a letter to a few clients who came, but and I saw potential, and they came either once or twice, or maybe even 3 or 4 times, and then stopped coming. And the letter is basically saying, I understand what's thing that's really different here is that I'm asking you to do the work. And
Hmm.
and that's not, I've worded it a little better, but basically I realize that's not the paradigm you're used to. You're used to someone coming down and working on you. But actually, for this to be helpful and successful, you can't check out. You can't just lie on the table. You need to be
Mm.
involved, because
Mm.
there is a sense of an embodiment, not just the body just again checks out and somebody does to you. For a car mechanic, that works great. The car doesn't have
Mhm.
sentience and it isn't self-healing in various ways, although maybe newer cars are, but the car doesn't have to really be involved in the same way. But the human does. And the there's actually a sort of another side to this about the embodiment side is I don't know in the UK, but in the US, the word is everywhere. It's and so I see people using the word
Mm.
that for me, how I would use the word, it doesn't make any sense. It's become a catch, a branding, a marketing tag,
Sure.
which is everything does that. It's more or less fine, but it's a tricky thing. Then how do you market the thing when the thing is now being marketed or explained in another way? How do you actually bring value to that if that's the way you're trying to go in?
Yeah, sure. I think that again, with a word like embodiment, the definition is primary. You start with
Mm,
an agreed definition, I think, because it will mean different things to different people, I guess, in different contexts as well.
mm. For me, well, I'd be curious for you, and this is something we briefly talked about. How does phenomenology come into embodiment for you?
Well, Uwe Goddard says he has an article. I'm not sure if it's in the Journal of Structural Integration. I think it might be in a different area, but it's on the Pedro Prado site in Brazil.
Mm, mhm,
And he says, I am in the space and the space is in me. So you have
mhm,
this whole idea of um, a bidirectional influence between the environment and the subject,
mm,
which can be affected by the way we perceive the environment, because
mhm,
perception is selective.
mm,
So the Rolfing movement work is good at this, because it will say something like, lie down and imagine that you're lying on on moss or warm sand. And these imagination pieces have the ability to affect your experience
mhm,
within the environment you're in. I mean,
mm,
the classic example is the unbendable arm, where you
mm,
have your arm out straight and someone tries to bend it, and you're trying hard to resist it, but they bend it.
mm,
And then you ask them to imagine a vector going from the hand out through the window, and maybe the backspace too.
mhm,
Then it becomes very difficult to bend. There is an explanation for that in terms of muscles. It's
mhm,
because when you do the imaginary vectors, you turn off the biceps
mhm,
so that it's easier to bend. Whereas if you're struggling with it, you tend to compress and turn on both the biceps and the triceps.
mm,
So there's a lot of this in movement, you know, class and training, where you can be walking around the room, for example. Rebecca Carly Mills did this in the online class I did. She got us all walking around the room and just asked us to stop somewhere. We stopped somewhere in the room. You
mhm,
choose somewhere in your own room. It was online. And you stop there and you settle for a minute maybe. And then you walk around again and choose a different place to stop. And the teachers are able to get you to be in the frame of mind and body state where you're attentive to how that experience of the two different places is playing out in your perception and in your body. And it changes depending on the place. So there are plenty of things like this where imagination is used to change our experience in the body. Even within the same environment, we just attend to it differently.
mhm,
And I think if you go back to, I'm not sure if this is correct, philosophically, but if you go back to Kant, and he talked about the phenomena and the phenomena, I mean, we do have the word phenomenology. I believe that he came to the conclusion that we could never perceive reality as it actually is, yeah? And all we could really perceive was the appearances that are the phenomena. So I don't think he was a phenomenologist, but that then opens up the idea that the appearances are worthy of study in themselves, which I'm guessing is what Husserl and Heidegger picked up, yeah? So I think, I can't remember the original question you just asked, but I think that the phenomenology is important and relevant to bodywork because there's a very real relationship between the environment and the person, which often gets completely overlooked in everyday life until you've been pointed to that possibility. And I think this can be used in Rolfing sessions to great effect. It can be used in little movements that we do on the table, getting people to go into peripheral vision, for example, instead of foveal focused vision. And there's all these little tricks that, you know, Uwe Goddard talks, I think, about people who'd had breast cancer or something, and he could perceive the kinesphere changing in the arm where breast cancer was and all this kind of stuff. And I think this is really powerful, and that, to me, you could say that's phenomenology to a certain definition.
A few things I want to just go over, hit that you said. You know, and sometimes it's annoying because we're having these talks where we're just in agreement, and it's like you want the
challenge me, please.
But no. These aren't. I'm just saying that, like, you know, some of these talks end up becoming like a love fest where it's like we're on the same page. So, for one thing, I want to clarify, as I understand it, when you talk about Rolf movement, I sometimes will say tonic function inspired Rolf movement, because I think Hubert Godard, when I first did my training, I didn't really know what Rolf movement was, and it was just a hodgepodge of different things. And I think for years it kind of was that, and that Hubert gave a language to it. But not every Rolf movement practitioner has studied tonic function, and I don't think if everyone then necessarily agrees with it. But but from what I hear you saying, and I'm again sipping the same Kool-Aid, I agree that the tonic function and Hubert and then his disciples, the people who spread the gospel of tonic function model, would agree. But I make that clarification because not all Rolf movement people that I meet are aware of what we're talking about, and they may not even like what we're talking about because it doesn't fit into their model of it. But for you, me, and the people who are in that tonic function, 100%.
On that
Please.
One, so I studied with Vivian J and Lyle Keane back in '98. I did the movement right on the end of the training, which was great. We were in Brazil at the time. We were on the beach. It was wonderful. But I didn't get the most out of the movement training because I was a rookie Rolfer, just qualified. And the kind of movement that was brilliantly taught then was more like the Mabel Tobbs type stuff, which is going very into the interiority of the person, imagine eyes closed. I didn't know about tonic function until about 5-6 years ago. And then I did online classes, and it took time, but it once it washed over me, the key difference is attention to the environment.
Yes. And how the human is in relation to the environment, and the environment is in relation to them, and or how they're related. For sure. And I think that's the key, is when does a movement become an exercise, and when does it become an experiential, we might say, or when does it become you know, and how do you make the movement or the whatever you're doing for the person, how do you make it?
Richardson has a brilliant article about this, about core stabilization. And she talks about exactly this, in that she's let's take the word critical out of there, but she's pointing out that in Pilates and even yoga, it can be very gymmy and just an exercise and just doing for the sake of it.
Mm.
Whereas it's very different if you attend to the pre-movement, for example, before you
Hmm.
actually move. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
that's
Yeah.
that. No, that's a great way, because that, I have clients who come in and they say, well, I do like, these embodied arts such as yoga. And I'm a yoga teacher. I've spent a lot of time studying it. And what I'll say to them is that at its core, yeah, yoga would be an embodied practice, but it might not be. It can be
Sure.
taught in a way that is not very embodied, and it becomes a bit of a routine of sort, where we're
Yeah.
going in and we're not moving with and as our body, but we're moving. The point of locomotion is a part of our neofrontal cortex. That's
Yeah.
kind of that's a lot of driving the show. And you could have two people that, if you looked at them, might look like they're doing the same thing, but one could be very deeply enriched and in this embodied place, and one may not be. But the key difference, I think, for me and for you, what I'm hearing is, how is that person relating with the space?
Hmm.
And there's so much information in that. And I think this is one of the hardest parts of teaching Rolfing or Rolf moving, it is, how do you learn to observe that? I think a big part of it is learning about it in yourself, for sure. At least in my own experience, it has been that. And it reminds me of, like, why one of the possible reasons Dr. Rolf said, go study this for 5 years, and don't do anything else, is it's really, the reason I know what I know when I work on people is because I've seen the thousands of people before them. And
Yes.
there's this quote by, I think it's Roland Becker, the osteopath, and I'm trying to remember the exact quote. How do you know when you work on someone that, like, you're feeling an injury from 10 years ago? And he's like, go work on, like, a lot of people, and when they tell you the injury is from 10 years ago, like, that is informing you.
Yeah.
He says it much more beautiful than that. But it's like, then, so you're starting to learn, how do you actually know how to pick up the phenomena, is just partly being around it for a while. But I also think a big part is the own self work, and the own self contemplation, receiving work as well, be it by a Rolfer or some other sort of, again, I'll use the word embodied practices, which we still haven't maybe necessarily defined, and also maybe a bit challenging to define. Because
Hmm.
how do you define, how does a pre-verbal experience get defined? That's a challenge of
But also,
sorts.
I think Kevin Frank points this out in one of his articles too, that one of the most difficult thing is to see in our
Hmm.
work. One of the most
Hmm.
difficult things is to see.
Mm.
And how do you see? They say, oh, you can see a pre-movement, which I think they call anticipatory postural activity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
The, how do you see that? Well, it's the same thing that you said. You see it again and again and again. It makes me
Hmm.
wonder what life would feel like
Hmm.
if I hadn't become a Rolfer. You know,
Mm. Oh
what
my
what are
God.
my hands feeling? That how would they have been if I hadn't touched many people for many, many thousands of hours? Yeah.
I it's amazing that I was at the grocery store yesterday, and there was this huge line, and I was just watching this one person who, without sounding judgmental, just clearly, and there may have been, they just were not with it. They were missing so
Yeah.
much. And I remember looking at them thinking, that looks so much more enjoyable. That looks so much more
Really?
enjoyable. Yeah, a little bit. I know it's both ways. Yeah, because when we're more sensitive and more aware, and maybe I just have more work to do, like, I can feel someone three rows behind me and how they're holding their body. And I'm aware of, like, different things going on in the space around me. My body is kind of always in a state, or maybe my mind, or both, are in the state of sort of awareness that is not always enjoyable. Or, like, I'm aware of I'm sitting here and aware of, like, 3 or 4 places in my body that I could use some work right now that I can't quite get to.
Yeah.
I don't focus on them, but, like, wow, if I could, there's a Simpsons episode from years ago where, like, it's Homer. I mean, the Simpsons was so great, but they find out he has, like, a crayon in his brain, and that's why he's so dumb. And then when they take the crayon out, he's really bright. But at the end, he can't relate to anybody anymore, so he ends up putting the crayon back into his nose.
Oh God.
It's so brilliant. So yeah, I mean, I definitely, I love where I am, and I don't necessarily want that, but there was a piece of that of wow, I that the ignorance is bliss, the not knowing, not feeling, not perceiving in some ways is, yeah, there's something kind of, grass is always greener, Alan, so.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
Mm.
you hit this point too, that one of the things I say to my clients a lot is I'm wanting you to learn how to see, not to look,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
separating that of how do we learn to see, which is really, yeah, for me, when you're talking about like, seeing that body move over and over again, it's also seeing is it's perception, because it's not just, at least for me, it's not just the observation from the sense of eyes. It's how my body in space is responding with them as well too. What information is being sent through that, through the person moving in the space? How is my body, again, prior to me labeling it, just having felt sensation or awareness, and what does that information then convey to me that I can then, um, either share with them or help in some sort of way.
Yeah. I think the body schema comes to mind here
Mm-hmm,
because I think of the tennis player of who the serve is so fast that you don't have time to think about it. You just
mm-hmm,
respond instinctively based on thousands and thousands of times that you've hit that ball,
mm-hmm,
looking at the way the server shapes up before they hit it, and then you're just there in the groove, in
mm-hmm,
flow, you might say. And there is no time to think. It's based on experience. It's
mm-hmm.
based on pre-cortical,
Yeah,
subcortical.
subcortical. Yeah, yeah. It's all it's maybe not all habitual, but it's largely habitual.
Yeah,
And this is actually a great sort of, again, to kind of shift but stay in the same place,
sure.
because for for me, when we're looking at this embodiment and what does it mean to be embodied, well, there's like a joke for me that the only everyone is embodied unless you're
Yeah,
dead.
yeah, yeah.
Unless you're dead. So in some way, what does it mean? Well, one of the ways I've been thinking about it, from, at least with the neuroscience, is how much am I in cortical, how much am I in subcortical, and how much am
Mm.
I aware that I'm in, so like how much am I aware of the habits happening and I have a little bit of agency in shifting them, or how much am I just in this, auto repeat, which you mentioned Peter Levine's work, and there's lots of other trauma modalities,
Hmm.
but I wouldn't even want to necessarily say, I don't want to label them as trauma per se, because they're just ways of looking at how people learn to habituate. And trauma is a great way because it's so intense. And so
Hmm.
it's you can see much more in a way, and see how people, when the fire is really hot, how that cooks. But it's really about, and polyvagal theory, I think, also really helps with that, and sort of looking at how has the human being, again, learned to sort of be, where is their level of safety in the world, and how are they moving in and from that way. And I find that embodiment fits into that really well, or those really help with that. And that's also the same with what we're doing with work, is somebody, if somebody's coming in, they're coming in with X number of years of life and being in the
Yeah.
world.
Hmm.
There's some more phenomenology, how they are being in the world.
Yeah.
And we don't, I remember from my basic training, like learning this and not fully understanding it. They said if someone comes in with scoliosis, you wouldn't actually want to like fix it that day, right? Or like if you
Yeah.
could, because it'd be too much. You want to slowly do it over time, because this they've tilted so long in a certain way for a certain reason that's largely habitual. Of course, there can be, it's not everything is neurons. There is there is, bone growth and things in different shapes, but at least in this model, there is this way of being in the world, of adapting to the world, that serves the purpose. The question is it still serving the purpose, and are we, which state of neural functioning is largely happening? And for me, just to somewhat try to tie it together, embodiment is neither one nor the other. It's still a bit about both, and what is serving us or could serve us a little more.
I happen to think, though, that
Mm-hmm.
what I mentioned before about going to the Cartesian split and being
Mm-hmm.
mind identified, that I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm very interested in the trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and people like using Gendelin, the
Oh yeah,
focusing,
it's
Richard
great.
Swart, the internal family
IFS,
system.
yeah.
I've listened to a lot of these guys over the last few years, since the lockdown, really. And I would, it seems to me that if someone has a, shall we call it a psycho-emotional issue that is of concern to them,
Mm-hmm.
again and again, the way through that, the way to process that, the way to overcome and get to the other side of that so that the quality of life is better is through attention to sensation. So, for example, if you've got some kind of psycho,
Mm.
oh my God, the world's closing into me, we're doomed. I can't help thinking about the future, and I'm anxious and I'm scared. So where do you feel that in the body? I can't feel it. I can't. Well, let's just stay there and see if there's anything you can pay attention to in the
Mm-hmm.
body. And usually
Mm-hmm.
people go there. And once you pay attention to sensation, and I think language does come into it, and that's a good label in that sense, then it starts to change.
Yeah, I'll put one small addendum to that.
Sure.
And right now I'm in a large trauma, an online trauma course that brings a lot of different models in. So I'm learning a
Yeah.
lot as I'm going. But for some people, attention to sensation at this time would not be helpful.
Without doubt. Yeah, I'm sure that nothing is for everybody, but that
Well,
does
but
quite a lot, yeah, in terms
yeah,
of.
yeah, I agree. I agree with you. I wanted to put the addendum on that. For some people, it would not necessarily be at this time about attention to sensation as much as attention. It still would, in a way. We could break it down and say, "Hey, you're still about that," but it's about attention to response to sensation, or
Okay,
so
nice.
so that the sensation is too much, and there's a lot of people with various tra- traumatic issues of the body is no longer is just on fire or
Yeah,
uncomfortable, and they do not want to, and so bringing them into
yeah,
that sensation would actually be in that moment possibly more traumatic. And
yeah,
so then it's bringing them to response, or sort of even maybe bringing them out some way. I'm trying to
yes.
think of an example with clients, but I would agree with you that the base of it is the so to tie it into phenomenology again for me, the sensation is how we exist with the world. We exist with the world through largely the five senses. I'm sitting in the world as I sit through it. I smell, I taste them. That sense data comes up to my brain and gets mixed in and gives me whatever it is that it takes it to be. And so it is the senses that are the interface between us and the world. You can bring
Hmm.
body schema and somewhat into that too. I don't know enough of the neuroscience, I guess, of that. So it's that these largely the sensations are. So therefore, they're very important to do that. The issue comes in when the senses are going up to a meaning making unit up
Right,
above, and when
right.
there's well, I'll call it bad programming in the meaning making thing,
Hmm.
then sometimes that you have to, and I don't love the word have to, but I would say that you have to work with that. But it's not just working with that. There's a
I'm sure it's not. It's more. Yeah,
yeah,
indeed.
yeah, and it is bringing stuff in.
But yeah, I agree with that. But what I guess I want to underline the point that by not paying attention to sensation, without doubt, we live through the five senses. Paying attention to the sensation because we're so in our heads and mind identified. There can be, to use the old terminology, emotions trapped in the body, for example,
Mhm.
that we're just pushing down
Mm.
because, and it would be very useful if we were able to be more in touch with the body.
Yeah, although we can spin around a bit. You say we're in our head, but is the head not part of the body?
No, no, yeah, I see that, but think of schooling, for example. We sit at our desks for 7, 8 hours a day, looking at a board, taking in knowledge. If we're lucky, we do sports at school, so we get some movement. If we're unlucky, we don't. We're encouraged to compete intellectually so that you are first, second, third, or 30th, or whatever it is. Our identity is invested in that as a primary identity, a thinking, a
Hmm.
res cogitans, as Descartes would put it, as a
Hmm.
thinking entity. But there's so much more to it than that. That's an important part. But to
Hmm.
make that the primary part, I think inevitably we lose something in terms of quality of life.
Yeah. There's a comedian I just heard recently who's working on a bit where he was saying how, like, ask anybody who the fastest person in their elementary school was, and they can tell you.
Mhm.
And so that there was at some point, at least for children, and maybe more so for boys, at least when I grew up, the fastest person was not necessarily the smartest. They may have been, but the credibility was too how you move your body, or how there was
Mhm.
something super exciting about that, which
Mm.
I really appreciated, because I think we can do exactly what you're saying and look at it from this sort of, okay, we're priming the mind, and we are for sure, and yet until the powers that be really enforce, you have to be a good student, and they are enforcing at a young age, but there's still this sense of the strongest, the most, like, the most active body is the most exciting, or most, that's who
Mhm.
you want to be. But I want to, again, I think in a lot of ways we're in the same way. There's something where I've been coming right now, and again, I don't have enough neuroscience of it, is I think of what you're saying as being in the mind as really being more in our our frontal
Default
cortex,
mode
largely.
network.
Yeah, default mode network and frontal cortex, and being in the body as really more of, are we in subcortical structures?
Sure.
And
Yeah,
and I've
nice
been,
one.
yeah, because I've really been wanting to. I have so many clients coming in saying, "Oh, yeah, my massage person said I have trauma trapped here because this is where trauma gets trapped, or this." And I think, and I used to believe that model somewhat because it made sense. I was excited, and then obviously Bessel van der Kolk's body keeps the score. But what I've really been shifting to is, body's a scoreboard. Body's a reflection of the score, because I don't think it's actually in the body. I think it's much more in the the structures of the subcortex that are informing that, which is again why sense data becomes really important. Is it's going up through various sensual input, various ways of getting translated in, but it's not necessarily in the body. But yes, the brain is part of the body.
I think that
But
Damasio talks about that kind of stuff. Yeah.
yeah,
How the emotions. I have a quote from Bessel van der Kolk if you'd like to hear it.
yeah, sure.
So he says, we have ability to regulate our own physiology,
Mhm.
including some involuntary functions of body and brain, through such basic activities as breathing, moving, and touching. Bottom
I mean,
up.
well, yeah, yes, and you've hit a, he's the person leading this class I'm in right now, and I have to
Lovely.
say, no, I have to say he's one of the least embodied people I've seen.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, he
And
does say he's had Rolfing though. You know that, no?
he's had Rolfing, and he's all in this class. All he talks about, like, he talks about tapping and psychedelics and any sort of thing that I would say is actually not a bottom up process. He's largely about of avoiding the felt experience into having a conceptual experience of a felt experience.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's
That's
really
very
interesting.
interesting.
Him and Stephen Porges have a talk, and it's just so interesting to, like, watch these two leaders, because Stephen is so slow, and his body,
Mhm.
and Bessel is just this. I mean, he's done so much great, and I get that. And he's probably done so much great because of his dysregulation. I think that the people who usually do the best are the more dysregulated, because they have that steam
Interesting.
to push through.
Interesting.
Um, but I have this other thing that I get stuck with, where, I'm in Boston. There's all these there's Harvard's over there, and MIT, and all these, like, real intellectual places, and they talk about body mind. They talk about bottom up, top down. And I watch a lot of these people, these speakers, or the people leading the research centers, talking about bottom up. And for me, I say, well, that's not a very bottom up. You're living in a top down version of a bottom up, which is still top down. So, you can explain it all the day, but what is it? How are you living it? How are you experiencing it? And I don't find, and I know that might sound really rude or egotistical. I don't mean it as that. It's just my experience at this point. I don't see much of the bottom up, and so I'm seeing this way of like keep talking about bottom up so that it kind of makes sense, but it's still this top down. And what's going to happen is it's going to be the same as embodiment, where we have something that is being explained in a slightly different way, and it loses the actual value of the original thing. But
Mm.
that's my bias at this point.
I think
I
it's a deep irony, isn't it, that this message of embodiment and living a life of being, let's say, attuned to the senses
Mhm.
is best communicated through people who don't really live that way themselves.
Yeah, I've
Sometimes, yeah.
no, I mean, I find I unfortunately have never had her on the show, and I've been trying, but like I find Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen to be one of the most amazing embodied pioneers in the world.
Mm.
And she does right, but like, why don't you see her name more? And I
Mm.
think it's sort of like because she's very deeply embodied. Why don't you
Mm.
see, Kevin's wife Karen is amazing. Why don't you see more? And I think I've shared Kevin shared this quote with me where, or I was in a training once, and he more or less said, like, are you okay if this whole like thing that you're doing never, being Rolf in environment never really takes off? And I was so upset at the time because I was so like, no, this is the best. And I was more, I would say, dysregulated or and really wanting it, and my ego was attached. But I think
Mm.
ultimately when you really get into the senses, it's who do you need to convince? and and why? And I'm still struggling with that, because for me, I feel like this can save people's lives and it's really important. But yet the more that I push and I do that, the more dysregulated I become, less embodied I become. And there is this sort of irony there.
Who do you need to convince? The world. You
Yeah,
need to convince the world.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. How does a paradigm, to use like Jeff Koons' work, or like an epistemic to use Foucault's work, like how do you get a paradigmic or an epistemic shift? And that's what I believe is almost needed here. But of course I do. It's what's become my life. So like, of course
Yeah.
I believe it. And I think the follow up is like, what if we're wrong, Alan? what if what
I
if
don't, well, I'm not attached to being right.
Yeah,
It,
yeah.
it's just, it's about being authentic, isn't it?
Mm.
I
Well, it's
believe that it's important. It doesn't have to be right as such, but I believe it's really important. And, for me, it's based on the experience I had growing up, which was a nice childhood, but there was this background of identifying with the mind, which without having space for emotional expression, for example. So
wait, a
this
British a British person growing up without this is crazy.
yeah, that's the stereotype, right?
Yeah,
I'm one of the breakout people.
yeah.
But yeah, stoicism and lack of and grin and bear it is the attitude,
Hmm.
really. So
Stiff upper lip. Keep
stiff
calm and
upper
carry
lip,
on.
which
Yeah.
has its place, especially in the Second World War, when
Hmm.
you had to kind of knuckle down and there were rations and things like that. But it's like when you've come through to the other side, it seems very important that you've seen
Hmm.
something very important, like Plato coming out of the cave, yeah?
Hmm.
Having a look to see what it's like, really, and coming
Hmm.
back and trying to communicate it to the people inside the cave who are just looking at the shadows, yeah?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And so I don't care if I'm right because
I
it
didn't
feels,
mean, well, what I meant by right was the importance. Like, what if we're wrong that it's
yeah,
not that
important.
important?
Yeah.
But what if we're wrong in that way? What if we're
Well,
wrong in it?
but it's important to me and it's
Hmm.
important to the people I know. So,
Hmm.
in my family, for example, but I don't talk like this to my wife.
Hmm.
But, it's like
Yeah.
it's it feels real. That's what it just feels real, Andrew.
Mm.
It feels
Well,
real. That's
I
good
think
enough.
that it is, and I think that's a great way. Maybe I don't want to actually finish because I think we're having a great conversation, but also I try to keep keep mind of people listening and like when the 2 hour conversations go on. But I think you raised a sort of almost a really lovely way of tying it back together, which is you don't talk about this with your wife, but this is
Yes.
important, but this is important stuff to you. And it's important stuff for me too. And I don't necessarily talk about it with my wife. Not that I don't want to, I just, she doesn't enjoy it, or she's, without sounding higher or lower, she's still in the cave and I'm not, or I'm still in the cave and she's not, whatever way you want to look at
Probably a bit both.
it. Yeah. So that there we go, that we get to have a conversation, or for people listening, get to listen into a conversation on this subject or on these subjects, which are so important to us, which do have value, and in which we are still trying to find the wording or the whatever it is for it that we do find so embodying and enriching.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's well, also, this is what we do, though, isn't it?
What?
Our families, we're just living day-to-day life, and that's what we do is a part of that. But when our identities are invested in what we do, then
Mm.
we take it very seriously with humor, but we take it very seriously, right?
Mm. Do
And
you, I guess, well, with that, would you, this is something I've chatted about with a few people, and why I do take it so serious is that, and I'd be curious your take. For
yeah,
me, my practice is a reflection of who I am in the world and how I go through the world. And
yeah.
so my work is so much a reflection of myself. And that might not be the right way. It's just where I am right now. I'll be curious your take on that.
Well, Rolfing to me, it's a calling, isn't it? It's the difference between just a job and a calling. Because it's so meaningful to be in a situation where you're meeting someone in their soma
Hmm.
and and improving their quality of life in many cases. And we want to help people. I'm guessing most Rolfers derive meaning from the ability to help people. And compare that to commuting in London an hour each way in a crowded train and getting off at an office and sitting on a computer all day.
Mm.
I would not derive much meaning from that. The meaning I might get is from the people in the office around me with human connections. And we're getting that every day in our practice, every day, in a rich phenomenological experience, to use the word again. And I think
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
think it's really, it's a gift. It's a real gift. It just kind of gets me that I'm not trying to go off on a tangent here, but it just gets me that still not many people really know about Rolfing, because I think we are onto something important, and more people would benefit from knowing about it. That's the way I think. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
I agree. I agree. I just wanted to say I don't necessarily think it has to be Rolfing. I think any somatic practice
yeah, for sure. No,
truly
for
has
sure.
that. And
Yeah.
I also, not to be a devil's advocate, but I think the hardest, like the reason I agree with you on one part, I fully agree with you, and then part of me doesn't, is because I think to some extent we still haven't really defined Rolfing as a community. And when I hear you saying about how like wanting to help people, and I say I would agree with you for many, but I also think that some people, if you look at the core of it, it isn't really that. I think that
Mm.
there's a power struggle that can be of wanting to have to not necessarily to help people, but to have this sense of again, we've said this word over and over again, ego. But there's like I don't I think that the difference between when the Rolfer is no longer a doer, these are my sort of terminologies. When they're no longer a doer, but they're a beer, and they're being with someone instead of doing to, then they are what you're talking about. But I think there is still a type of Rolfer, and not just Rolfing, any SI, but any body work or any or even other somatic practices, who is still has the line where they're doing to people. And when you have that incongruence in terms of that type of power. There's always going to be power things. The people are coming to us, so we have this sense of responsibility and power, but there's different ways of playing with it. I think when you're doing what you're saying, yes, fully, but I don't think that our community, that everyone does that or has that. And so again, it comes
I'm naive. I'm probably quite naive, because that's just the
well,
way
you're probably, I mean, I'm a New Englander, so I'm I joke. I mean, not every New Englander is that, but I'm a New Englander, so I'm naturally critical in
Sure.
various ways. But I've also, and I think I'd love to be wrong, but I've just seen it. I've been in the trainings I've been in, and seen the
Right.
people, and I would say I see the way that I perceive the world. I see it with teachers in that, and I actually think a lot of people who become teachers actually do it for that reason.
Mm.
There are teachers who want to teach because they love and they want to share these art, but there are also those who become a teacher in 5 or 6 years after graduating. And there's a part of me that says, that what is pushing you to that? I mean, it doesn't have to be, it could be what we're talking about, but I feel like no, there's this invisible thing that, again, I don't find. At some point I'd love to have a deeper talk about this. I've chatted with a few people about the Rolfers who are contemplative versus the Rolfers who are not contemplative. And again, it doesn't have to be Rolf for any practice, because I'd say you see the same thing in meditation circles, about when and who wants to be in a sense of power, and there's an irony, of course, in that. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I could go on more, but I just sound like a curmudgeon.
Not really.
Okay.
I just haven't really, my eyes haven't been open to that in trainings. Maybe I just wasn't really noticing it, but I'm sure it does happen. I'm sure it does. Any group, there are power hierarchies, and it's a dangerous path to tread, in my opinion. You look at all the yogis who've got into trouble through power abuse. I think that it's a way of being that I don't agree with.
Yeah.
Put it simply, yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why neither of us are teaching. Well, we are. I mean, every day our clients, we are. Well, Alan, I could, clearly we could chat and vibe for hours, as it's already been over an hour, but I do have.
No worries.
Yeah. Thank you for making time for this talk. It's been one of my, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but it's been one of my most favorite, because it's talking about what I love.
Sure.
And I hope it's been enjoyable for you.
No, I've loved it. It's been really nice. Yeah.
And more, I guess most important, I'm really happy to have a new connection with you. So I'm sure we'll have back and forth WhatsApps. I look forward to being more in touch, and wishing you an awesome day.
Take it easy.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to us at Touching into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Alan at rolfing-london.co.uk. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching into Presence. Bye for now.